Good morning. I see folks are still setting up. Good morning. This is the VIEDA Wednesday webinars. Welcome. My name is Chanel Peterson. I am the Virgin Islands Economic Development Authority's Managing Director for Marketing and 2040 Vision. Today, I am so excited to be partnering with the Disabilities Rights Center of the Virgin Islands, DRCVI, and the Northeast ADA. And today's webinar will be discussing ADA reasonable accommodation during COVID-19. First off, just a couple ground rules for today's webinar. We do ask that everyone stay muted. When you do have a question, you can always go ahead and raise your hand. So to raise your hand, you can go ahead and click on participants, and there should be an icon that says raise hand. And we would be more than happy to hear your questions, comments. This is definitely a webinar where we want to engage our audience. If you're feeling a little shy today, you can always place your comments, questions, or inquiries in the chat. And then for those listening live on Facebook this morning, please feel free to place your comments as well in the chat, as we will be monitoring comments on Facebook. And so with that said, I guess one last rule, ground rule, because I know this question always comes up after the webinar. We will be placing the recording as well as the presentation on our website at usvieda.org/webinars, and you will see that link later on today again, as well as placed in the chat. So I'm excited to introduce our main speaker this morning, Ms. Shami Carr, advocate of the Disability Rights Center of the Virgin Islands. Ms. Carr.
Good morning, and thank you, Chanel, and thank you everyone for joining today. Good morning to you today, and hope everyone is doing well. And it's a very trying time, so we just appreciate your attendance and such an important topic as we talk about reasonable accommodation, people with disabilities, and COVID-19. So I'm going to switch and share my PowerPoint. So just give me 1 second, please. And okay, Chanel, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So again, thank you everyone for joining. We want to make sure today that there's a few things that you have to take away with. We know during COVID-19, it has just been such an unprecedented time in the workplace. It's been an unprecedented time in terms of vaccines and trying to roll it out to the people who need it. And it's also an unprecedented time for the Americans with Disabilities Act for a couple of reasons. One is that last year was the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a major milestone, but it was also a milestone that was right in the middle of a pandemic. So some people lost a message, certainly, with COVID being such a on the forefront. But the ADA really set a lot of precedents. And one thing we're going to talk about today, amongst many things with the ADA, is we're going to talk about a reasonable accommodation called Telework. And it's interesting because now that the face of the workplace has changed to virtual workplaces, Telework's been actually around as a form of reasonable accommodations for over 17 years. So again, the ADA was something that kind of brought that forward, and during the pandemic, and how now it's kind of all merging together. And we're gonna talk about that very specifically. I want to make sure that in terms as a small business, sometimes you don't have all the space or the physical allocations or whatever it may be as a larger business would. So how do you make sure that you comply with HIPAA? How do you make sure you do that during COVID? There are rules and regulations certainly that stay intact, whether it's on-site documentation storage or whether it's virtual, and we'll talk about that. And we'll certainly talk about different ways to provide reasonable accommodation. I gave one example in terms of telework, but we're going to talk about numerous ways, especially during the virtual environment, to make sure that the essential functions of their jobs are being done. But on one hand, that employees with disabilities are being protected due to disability, but also that they're able to do the work that they were hired to do. And at the end of the conversation, at the end of the day, reasonable accommodation comes down to being reasonable, and it comes down to making sure that the essential functions are still being done, but done in a way that's effective. So that's what we're hoping today, that there'll be some walkaways for you. We're going to go over a lot of different types of resources related to COVID-19, and we're certainly going to give you a lot of different ways to look at reasonable accommodation, whether it be small businesses, on-site or off-site. So I thought I would just start with a polling question. And Chanel, I'm not sure how to facilitate that, but if it's possible, if we could ask, or maybe just a raise of hand to know, is your business currently open? That's the first thing. Is it currently operating? Before we even have the conversation about reasonable accommodation, is to know, where you're at with your business. Is that something that we might be able to get a little feel from the audience?
Yes, it is, Shami. We're going to pull that up right now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Looks like we got just a couple more folks waiting to respond. So we'll give them 5 more seconds.
Okay, why are you telling me where you're going next month? I don't understand.
All right, wonderful. Well, I'm very happy to see that nearly 4/5 of businesses are still open. And I'm going to take the NA, maybe meaning like you're partially open. So it looks pretty good that, businesses are still being able to render their services. Maybe it's differently. And again, that's the purpose of today's conversation is if you're doing business that's differently during the pandemic, we hope that this information will be able to not only make sure that you stay in compliance with the ADA for your employees with disabilities, but you might even find ways to streamline that for your customers. You never know where there could be a kind of a 2-for-1 to accommodations. All right, thank you so much, Chanel, for that. Thank you. Okay, so what we have seen, and we've been working with the COVID-19 and ADA now for at least 6 months in terms of really getting our hands around it. And I say we in the sense of Disability Rights Center to make sure that we, one, respond to the needs of the territory. And one of those big response, certainly when we talk to job seekers, as well as employers certainly, is how does the ADA apply during this time? What are my rights and what are my responsibilities? And again, we'll talk through that through this presentation. But just so you know off the tops, and do feel free to chime in if you've heard of other issues that have come up that you've seen. But the top issues that I would say in the last 6 months that's come up, that's really been right on the forefront, are such issues as direct threat with health, with COVID-19, of course, the cost of accommodations, including technology and undue hardship. And we'll talk about that towards the end. Transition of job duties. And as I mentioned, it depends on the essential functions. Reasonable accommodation never is reasonable to eliminate the essential functions. So what does that transition look like as you're trying to accommodate both maybe virtual and offsite? Or on-site, I'm sorry. And then of course, disclosure. There's a lot of different things that come with disclosure. It may be that the person has never disclosed they have a disability, but now all of a sudden they are disclosing it because of COVID-19. Maybe they already had disclosed a disability, but due to a secondary condition, maybe now COVID-19 has brought that forward. Maybe there's no disclosure, but when it comes to COVID-19 in terms of testing and a positivity rate, well, then you may have to disclose to such places as the Department of Health and other public officials. Again, how does that all weave in when it comes to the ADA? So disclosure with multiple agencies partnering to address COVID-19 and how to make sure that in the workplace that's done seamlessly to make sure that we address a public health issue, but we do it in a way that is also confidential and also make sure that the person with disability is protected. So if anyone else, I'm just curious in the chat box, has heard any other issues when it comes to the pandemic and the ADA besides these 4? Chanel, I can't see the chat box, so I apologize if there's any comments in there, but just curious if anybody had a comment on that.
No comments at this time.
Okay. So before we start knee deep into the ADA, one thing I want to make sure that you have right off the tops, if there's nothing else, again, with walkaways, this slide to me is one of the most important slides because this gives you the factual information, the technical guidance, the up-to-date information, and also some assistance. So the first thing I want to share with you is the EEOC, ADA, and COVID-19. And if we have time, I have it pulled up, we're going to go to that, but we'll wait to see if we have time. That is your go-to technical guidance. It is updated from the SARS pandemic almost 10 years ago. So this isn't a newly created document, it's an updated document. And we're going to, most all the information that I'll speak to today, even though I don't use specific citations or references, it is information that comes from that. So that is the guidance that we use certainly to do trainings, and that is something the employers should absolutely know where to go to for that. It's very extensive, it's very well laid out, and it's broken down into sections along with kind of a Q&A format. Under that, you can see I wanted to provide the EEOC Office of Legal Counsel Attorney of the Day telephone number. Small business, large business, doesn't matter, as long as you're a business and you're an employer. That we did a training back in December, with the federal EEOC, the Small Business Liaison's Office. And when we did our training with COVID-19 and ADA, she provided this number, and she wanted to make sure that anybody in the United States and in the territories knows that for small businesses with employment, that this number is available to you, and it is specific to COVID-19. Please keep this in your pocket. You don't usually get free legal counsel every day of the week. I believe it's a 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So please take advantage of this. Questions that I cannot answer today, I'm going to refer you to call this number to get that assistance. So again, just a great opportunity. I know a lot of small businesses may not have legal counsel on staff, or they may have to retain one. Here's an opportunity where you can get free legal counsel per COVID-19. The FDA, yes,
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. It looks like we do have a comment in
Okay.
the comment section. Someone stated that wearing a mask makes it difficult for lip readers as one of their challenges and struggles currently.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'll answer that briefly, and then we can talk about a little bit more when we talk about reasonable accommodation and PPE. But I will mention that when there is a customer service issue and masks, as we know, it's difficult for people sometimes with any kind of disability, a communication disability, let alone wearing a mask. I have seen some masks that are see-through that have offered lip reading, which makes it a lot more accessible. And that's something I'd be happy to follow up with. That's what I've seen so far to address that. Now, you can also wear a shield, but I don't know the full protectiveness of that, but certainly that provides a clear screen so someone can read lips. So that is being addressed. There are some PPE that addresses that. And if that answers your question, great. If you'd like more information, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I can certainly follow up with you individually as well. Okay, so Chanel, I'll go on unless they had any more thoughts with it.
It looks like no more thoughts currently. Thank you, Shannon.
Yep. So as I was mentioning with the FDA and the FAQ testing for COVID-19, again, another document resource guidance you should have in your back pocket. This is something that, again, when we look at small businesses to make sure that they have the up-to-date and the most clear guidance. Again, when we're talking about testing and also the CDC with a testing strategy, I do want to mention that now with the vaccine rollout, that the first document that I mentioned with the EEOC, ADA, and COVID-19 under section K talks about vaccines. And again, if we have time, we'll go into that specifically. It is more up to date in terms of the vaccine rollout as we are literally speaking. So, okay, so those are the three links you should keep all the time with you when it comes to not just the ADA, but also with COVID-19 in general in the workplace. I know that I believe as of Friday, or I know in the last week, that the U.S. Department of Labor also updated their OSHA rules to address COVID-19. I apologize, I didn't put that in here, but that is something to follow up with. If anybody would like that, I'd be more than happy to forward that. That's another link or resource I would say belongs on this page as well, to make sure that the the workplace that's set up, whether you're transitioning or reopening, or whether you're still in a hybrid system, that you're protecting all the workers and also the customers through the different kinds of workplace strategies with mitigating measures. Okay. So the first thing to do in terms of saying, okay, well, does this, where am I at when it comes to the ADA? How well positioned am I? First thing I always ask employers is, and I know small businesses sometimes don't have an employee handbook, but the first thing I ask employers is, have you updated that handbook since the pandemic? Your reasonable accommodation request might be come to office this, or come meet me here, or talk to the HR person. Well, that may look very, very different when it comes to reasonable accommodation during the pandemic. It could be virtual. There could be multiple steps. And again, have you updated your policies and procedures basically to make sure that your employees know how to request reasonable accommodation, again, amongst many things that have changed for the workplace. Another assessment is your business fluid between on and off site? I've been making remarks about hybrid and different ways to fluctuate your business. Some businesses can handle everything off site, even though they were on site. Some businesses cannot. They have to have a go-between. So do you have a good assessment? Sometimes they call that risk management, but do you have a good, sometimes business continuity, to make sure that your business fluidity during the pandemic? And again, that affects disability and the ADA, because if you have reasonable accommodations that are asked on and off site, again, I go back to the first bullet. Do employees know what that looks like during the pandemic? Mitigating measures, including personal protective equipment and modified workspace. I've alluded to that a bit between the OSHA, DOL guidelines, also with the CDC. And one of the things that is brought up many a times when it comes to the ADA and PPE is the question that somebody already brought up in terms of mask, but also in terms of what can the employer provide and what can the employee with a disability bring in that they feel would be more effective as a PPE. That's come up a bit, or other types of modifications. Maybe they have a personal venting system that works better for them, different things that'll help the space be more, conducive to COVID-19. And then, really lastly is, do you have a phased in approach to reopening? My understanding with the Virgin Islands specifically, but also in terms of tourism generally, is that it's probably going to be several months before the economy is back to normal, or some semblance of normal. So what does that phased in approach look like? Are you a business that relies on tourism that has to start looking at that transition? Or are you a business that's service related that you've already started to phase in because of some of the restrictions that have been lifted with Governor Bryant? So, where are you in that phase? And based on your commerce, based on your business service, or your deliverables, what does your reopening look like? Again, if we're talking about disability, what does that look like with employees with disabilities come back? Or how do you change the workplace to make sure that it's still accessible if you have to modify it due to some of the mitigating measures? Okay, so these are some of what I call the assessment of your workplace. If you see kind of where you're at and say, you know what, I've addressed one of these things, I haven't addressed the rest, or I've really addressed all of them, or I really didn't even know where to start. And so that's something that DRCVI would be more than happy to talk to you about, is where do you start? And we'll get you to the right resources and technical assistance and other organizations that do this to help small businesses to build capacity, when it comes to the ADA, particularly during the pandemic. So let's get into it in terms of what kind of business do you have? Do you have a business that's in person on site? Of course, you've got the CDC guidelines to mitigate the work environment. You've got the FDA guidelines when it comes to health protocols, including vaccines. Is it a place that's transient? Do you have customers that come in and out? Or is it an office setting with no customers? So kind of where are you at in terms of the in-person or on-site? Or are you the opposite? Are you more of a remote or virtual employer right now? Was there a transition to become a virtual environment? As I mentioned, some places went completely virtual. Some were able to do that. Is there a mixed way you deliver your services, again, on and off site? And are there computers and other technology needs to work at home for employees. And this definitely comes up crucially for employees with disabilities because of the fact something called assistive technologies might come up that would make them more effective to work at home based on the computer. Okay. So second polling question I want to ask is, my business has some or all of the employees working at home. This will help me to gauge in terms of the accommodations, virtual and off-site and on-site. So again, Chanel, if we can get them, awesome. You know, my business has some or all of the employees working at home.
It looks like we have half of the attendees have responded, so we'll give you guys just a couple more seconds, probably 10 more seconds, because we have quite a few folks who haven't voted as of yet. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it looks like, yeah, some, you know, almost half are working at home. A small percentage of not working at home, and then another large percentage. And I think the answer, okay, so was not a business owner. Okay, so let's just take the first two. I think that it's good to know that looks like majority of people are having, with a small business, having a blended situation. So we're going to go with that in terms of our conversation now that we talk about reasonable accommodation, because frankly, it is the world of virtual workplace. And I do want to reference back to something that I started with. So let's go back to now in terms of the ADA and get more specific. Those few slides beforehand was a way to kind of gauge where you're at with your business, because depending where you're at will help dictate how you do accommodations in the workplace. And so with that, I want to launch right into the ADA, reasonable accommodation, just to make sure contextually people know it's from the first section or the first title of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. As I had mentioned in the beginning, this is the 30th anniversary of the act. The EEOC had put out a telework guidance, as I mentioned, in 2003. That link is there. And again, you know, it's kind of it's an interesting quandary for us people in the disability community, whether we're advocates or people with disabilities, because we've been pretty much pounding the table to say telework is an effective way to do reasonable accommodation. And I can imagine that a lot of folks, even online, have said you might have had employees come to you, say, listen, can I work at home? You know, I was just talking to someone who's a senior veteran working 40 years at a business, and she was telling me how 20 years ago, if someone asked to work at home, it was such a rigmarole, most of the time denied request. And so things certainly have changed. But, you know, again, in the field of disability, we've been asking for this accommodation again over 17 years ago. We knew this would be an effective way. That gives a really good overview. And if the federal EEOC has put a guidance on it, it has helped to certainly strengthen that as a really good form of reasonable accommodation. So now we forward to 2021, and in the context of telework, that again, regardless if it's, you know, pandemic or not, both parties, meaning the employer and the employee with a disability, both have to comply, meaning they both have to meaningfully engage in the reasonable accommodation process. The number one reason why employers get dinged for not providing reasonable accommodation is not because they didn't provide it. It's because they didn't engage in the conversation. They either made it black and white where it was a yes or no, or they lagged so behind in the request that it wasn't a meaningful engagement. And therefore, that's why a lot of small businesses and employers are dinged when it comes to reasonable accommodation, because of the meaningful engagement. I tell employees with disabilities, job seekers with disabilities, reasonable accommodation is not automatic. It is an engaging conversation where there's negotiation. And at the end of the day, the employer has the right to pick the accommodation. And the employee certainly has a right, though, to bring that request forward and to have that conversation. So you can look up, you can see through the EEOC charges. That's where employers fall short every time when it comes to reasonable accommodation. It's not the actual request or the accommodation, it's the fact they didn't engage properly. So talking about engaging, let's talk about how you can do that during COVID-19. Now, as we know, as we are literally speaking, we're doing virtual activities like a virtual training. I've been a trainer for almost 20 years, and doing virtual is, I'm used to it now, but usually when I train, I'm pretty colorful, and I like to do a lot of engagement, and I like to really be able to have that level of connectivity with people. It is much harder, certainly, in the virtual arena. So we're all experiencing this in different ways. How does that work now when we talk about respond to a reasonable accommodation? Well, the first thing you want to do as a small business, as an employer, is you want to make sure that you have laid out what that looks like for your employees, which means kind of going back to the employee handbook. Even if you just do an MOU or something that just says, listen, or just a quick policy and procedure fact sheet, anything to let them know right now, if you need reasonable accommodation, this is the process that we're doing it during COVID-19. And I want to ask, just by chance, the audience, does anybody have an updated or addressed that during COVID-19? I'm just really curious if any employers have done that. Chanel, is there any comment, any comment about that?
Nothing as of yet in the chat.
Okay, so certainly jump in if someone does. I'd be really curious to know. So the virtual request, as we know, we're doing Zoom as we speak. We do Teams. I think there's Cisco has another virtual platform. There's all these different platforms where we can now do face-to-face types of meetings. And when it comes to, as I just was talking about, the meaningful engagement of reasonable accommodation, I can tell you that it is very best as a good practice to do it face-to-face. This is an opportunity where it levels the playing field, because sometimes phone is not dynamic enough. Okay, so the virtual request is better. You can see each other, you can get a feel for each other. And also the fact is, maybe you're reviewing documents or you want to look over something. As we know, with these types of virtual platforms, you can also share documents. So that's always my first recommendation, is to have some sort of practice. You can turn it into a policy, but for right now, a practice that says, if you need reasonable accommodation, it starts this way. And know that we will do it in this fashion via Zoom. Please know if you have documentation, we're going to review it, and so forth. Okay, so that's what I call having a policy or practice in place to make sure every business is different. And we're going to talk about how that can sometimes look a little different depending on if you're virtual, hybrid, or on-site. So the virtual request can be any of those fashions. It could be that you're hybrid. It could be that you're on-site a lot. It could be mix. So that's, again, what works for you, that you think can get that meaningful engagement with the employees, is the one that I would pick. Okay. Secondly, is a hard copy request. Now, it used to be, and it's not per se the law, that you have to do it in writing. Okay, the request does not technically have to be in writing, but it certainly doesn't make it easier to document. So if you're dealing with a reasonable accommodation request during COVID and you want to keep the hard copy request process, then what I would suggest is to make sure that however you are disseminating information, that it is not only in compliance with HIPAA. If you're not making sure you're not soliciting information via email, you're not requiring them to send any hard copies via email if it's not HIPAA compliant. So you still have to be careful. It could be also that the hard copy request turns out to be something more of an in-person request. So for example, let's say that you have a staff meeting every 2 weeks virtual, and you've got maybe 10 people on your team. And as a business owner, you find this to be the most effective way, because even though you've got some people in the business on site, you've got some working at home, all of them can always be on Zoom or Teams. So you find that to be the best way, even though you've got people working. So you have decided as a business owner that you're going to continue to want to have your reasonable accommodation request done in person. You prefer it. You will just ask, you'll just have protocols. You'll follow the CDC guidelines. You'll be 6 feet apart with your mask on, and you'll have that conversation. And you can do it in person. So it's not out of, it's not like you can't do it in person. Some people prefer it. And even during COVID, you just follow the CDC guidelines. So you've got multiple ways to respond to the request. The number one thing I would do before any of this is to make sure that your own employees know how to make that request during the pandemic. Chanel, I want to turn it back to you. Are there any questions people have about this specifically?
So in the chat, we've got one individual that indicated they haven't had a request. And we did restate, have you had any reasonable accommodation requests? And thus far, we don't have any additional questions either in the comments or on Facebook at this time. Looks like you are providing all the answers, Shami.
There we go. Well, that's a good thing. Thank you, Chanel. And again, don't be shy. Do ask questions, but we'll keep on trotting, as I think we've got about, I'd say a good maybe about 20 minutes or so, and I'll make time for our evaluation as well as any Q&A. So I'm going to keep on cruising. Okay, so let's talk about documentation of disability. One thing that's so crucially important during COVID-19 is not to violate this. Employers have fallen on this already. First and foremost, as an employer, you have a right to ask for documentation of disability to substantiate the request for accommodation. As you heard, what I didn't say was substantiate the disability. The documentation of disability can be provided by a medical doctor or a healthcare provider, but it can also be provided by a rehab specialist or psychologist, because the most important thing in the documentation of disability is not the diagnosis, which is not required, but the actual manifestation or the impact of the disability. So I've had employers who say, I want that diagnosis, and technically that is not required. I've got employees or job seekers who tell me, oh, I just signed a release, they can get any information they want. Do not do that. Protect your information. So it's so important on both sides of the employer and the employee to know that you have a right to ask for documentation, but you have a responsibility to keep it stored away from personnel file and in compliance with HIPAA. So to get to the pandemic situation, some employers are using secured intranets or what they call portals and cloud services. And those are options you can use, but again, they must be HIPAA compliant. And so maybe now it's going to be that you have kept all your personnel and medical on site, separate, but on site. Maybe because of the pandemic, you've decided to make all your documentation now virtual, and you've secured some cloud service or some extra internet, or you created an intranet that can help with the database. Whatever it is that you've now transition to, just make sure it's HIPAA compliant, because you have a right to ask for documentation of disability, and employees with disabilities know that they have a responsibility to provide that to you. Okay. And there is guidance on medical exams in COVID-19. There's a lot of questions around, well, do I need a negative test to come back to work? Does that count as a medical exam? What's considered fitness for duty? Is vaccine considered a medical exam? So there's a lot of information, and I would definitely suggest any employers who have more questions about medical exams, particularly during COVID, to go to that. That's at the federal EEOC's website. So let's talk for a minute about examples of reasonable accommodation. Now, this is taken out of the Technical Assistant Manual for Title I with the EEOC. And though this is the list that was actually, this is over probably want to say at least 20 years old almost, but it seems dated, but it's not. It's still applicable, and that's why I use it all the time, because making existing facilities accessible has not really changed in the last 20, 30 years. It means making bathrooms accessible, common space accessible. If you are a business and you have a point of sale, is that accessible? Is it accessible for the customer? You know, we can also start to transition this to talk about accessibility of your merchandise and your business and your services online. So this still has broad application. When we talk about the first one with making existing facilities accessible, also it also goes into the whole CDC, PPE, and modified workspace as well. So that relates to that accommodation. Job restructuring is, I was talking about different ways that you can, you are blending your, and from what you guys were saying with the polling, that you've got a fair amount of a hybrid system going on with working at home. Job restructuring is another way to be able to do a form of reasonable accommodation. Sometimes that butts up to telework, sometimes it doesn't. So as an example, you might say, well, the job restructuring is because of COVID-19, that we're going to have someone who works with customers do it over the phone now. So it's still an essential function that this employee has, but we're going to restructure, do it differently. And now they can do it at home and talk to the customers that way, or virtual. So that's a way of job restructuring and including telework. Part-time or modified work schedules. So let's say, for example, that you have an employee who says that I have a secondary condition, I would like to work less. As a form of reasonable accommodation, if that works for the business, that is something that you can implement. Do know, and I tell employees all the time, if you use this form of accommodation, know that your pay and potential benefits will change per your status from full-time to part-time. I don't know if that's something during COVID that's in effect with you guys as businesses, but on a regular basis, if someone uses this as a form of reasonable accommodation, they should expect their change of pay as well. Acquiring or modifying equipment. Again, this really goes to a lot of the modified workspace as well as telework. And so again, I don't know if employers have butt up against this. I can tell you, if you're working with someone with a disability who has some needs when it's related to modifying equipment, please do let me know. I know of a resource that can help you to potentially get you that free equipment. So please let me know, especially if someone's talking about assistive technologies. There are some resources out there, and I'd be happy to connect you to see if you would potentially qualify for that. Changing to test training materials and policies. We were just talking about policies and modifying them. Maybe your trainings now are going to be all online. If there's someone who has a disability related to communication, just make sure, of course, that's accessible. If you're not sure how that works, you can give us a call. We'll get you to the right people who knows how to make trainings accessible, whether they're online and so forth. Providing qualified readers or interpreters. This is less common that we see with readers. Interpreters are still used. Again, this was before the pandemic, but it certainly helps during the pandemic that there's a lot of virtual interpreters. And so you can get an interpreter pretty much anytime. If you've got a situation where you've got to talk to your employee on a one-on-one basis, maybe it's a supervision issue, maybe you have someone who there's a change in the workplace or a change in protocol, you want to make sure that person absolutely understands that more than just reading it. Again, that would be a time for an interpreter. A lot of times I find that businesses shy away from people who are deaf or hard of hearing because of interpreters. The reality is that interpreters are rarely used during the workplace. They're used only when it's needed for effective communication, which is like staff meetings, supervision, things like that. Not every day, not all the time. And so if you want more information on how that works for people who are deaf in the workplace, please let me know. I'd be happy to give you a ton of information to show how they're great workers, but they also are not a great expense. And that's why a lot of employers don't hire them because of cost or the perceived cost. And then reassignment to a vacant position. I'm guessing with the small businesses that are on, most probably don't deal with unionized environments. This was a real blow to them because of the fact of reassignment. So if anybody's in a union on the phone, follow up with me. I've got more information on that. Reassignment to a vacant position is somewhat like a part-time or modified work schedule, in the sense that if you take a position that as a form of reasonable accommodation, the pay and the rate will go with that position, whether it's less or more. And so if there's an opportunity during COVID-19 where there is a vacant position that someone with a disability might do better, whether again, the pay is the same or not, if it's agreed upon reasonable accommodation, that certainly can be done even as a temporary situation during COVID-19. So I just wanted to give you some examples of reasonable accommodation. Some butts up to telework, some doesn't. Chanel, does anybody have questions on reasonable accommodations, or they'd like to bring up a question they have? All right, barring nothing, I will keep on moving just for the sake of time. One thing I want to talk about is specifically, and I brought it up before, is telework. Telework is a complicated form of reasonable accommodation, so plan some time to work through it. Again, I'd love to hear if anybody on the phone has already done this. Whether for people with disabilities or not, for that matter, as we mentioned, this was kind of a backbone of what's going on right now with COVID-19. Elements to think about in terms of telework, things like supervision, meetings, deliverables, returning back to work. How do you want to do that as a supervisor or as a business owner to make sure that the work is getting done, and that it's getting done on time, and that if there's issues, you know how to address them when people are working at home. Now, essential functions, I've said this a few times, I want to say it again. Essential functions of the job cannot be removed while teleworking. Essential functions of the job cannot be removed at all for reasonable accommodation, including telework. So if you've got employees asking you to not do certain parts that they were hired to do, that's not considered reasonable accommodation. Again, whether it's on or off site, whether there's a pandemic or not. That's one of the fears that we hear from employers, is that what if they can't do the job? Well, were they hired to do that job with or with accommodation? And if they were hired to do that job with or with accommodation, and if they're not doing the job with or without accommodations, then they're like any other employee that's not doing their job. Okay. And it can be a blended situation with telework, part-time in the office, part-time at home. Again, below is a link to that actual guidance. And that is something I think that we're seeing as the number one form of reasonable accommodation, certainly right now. Okay, so I want to just quick kind of go through these. These are some things that I derived from the EEOC COVID-19 ADA and Rehab Act guidance, which looks like with time we won't have time to go to it, but we certainly, the link is in a couple of places to access. So let's answer some questions. Do you have all the PPE you need to safeguard your workers? So from the perspective of an employee with a disability, part of reasonable accommodation can include mitigating measures as PPE. The employee can bring their own if it's equally as effective. This is very important because the fact is that part of reasonable accommodation is that employees can bring their own accommodation. It has to be approved by the employer and it has to be equally as effective. This is something that I know employers are not going to give much wiggle room to, because if it's not effective, that means people can get sick. So there's a pretty black and white situation with that. Do you have a vaccine plan? When it comes to employees with disabilities, employers can mandate vaccine as part of fitness for duty. Okay, it also has implications with direct threat, which we'll talk about in a minute. If the employee cannot take the vaccine due to disability, reasonable accommodation should be explored. That could include telework. That could include a different modified workspace. There's other forms that can be looked at. Maybe it's adjusted schedule, so there's less exposure. So if all of that has been explored, and if those accommodations cannot be implemented, then it is possible that the employee may not be able to work there. So employers can mandate vaccines, but they can't say carte blanche, if you can't take it, then you can't work here. What they have to say is, going back to reasonable accommodation, is there something we can do through reasonable accommodation? And if we can't, then now it may be possible. Okay. I know that's going to come up more and more, I'm sure, with the vaccine rollout. Are you able to shift your workers so that they are socially distanced? Employee with a disability. A reasonable accommodation could be if the essential function does not physically have to be done at the work site, then they could telework. Other options include modified work schedules, reassignment, and a leave of absence. And that's one I have not brought up in terms of leave of absence. That is an option to be able to leverage your accrued time. Let's say that someone would just not like to be in the office and they've got a lot of accrued time, whether it be personal, sick, vacation. Certainly that could be a form of reasonable accommodation to say, I'm going to take a short-term leave of absence. Okay. Are the essential functions only at the job site, or can it be blended with virtual? So the employee with disability. Reasonable accommodation does not require removing any essential functions. If the essential functions can be blended so that some work is on site and some at home, then that can be an option. Okay. So just a few scenarios. I want to wrap it up with just a couple of things. One is to talk about undue hardship. First of all, if the person doesn't even meet the definition of disability, they don't qualify for a request for an accommodation. I've talked to people who said, oh, I didn't tell them that I had a disability. Well, you cannot get reasonable accommodation if you do not disclose a disability. So they have to have a disability. And they also have to meet the qualifications of the job. But the fact that they're already there addresses that one. They can't pose a direct threat in terms of behavior or health. This is very, very much butting up to COVID-19, people who don't want to wear masks, people who are not quarantining when they travel, people who are not doing contact, doing the Department of Health tracing as they should. These are all posing direct threat issues. And, God forbid someone coming to work with COVID-19. So you can see where this is butting up with COVID-19 to be a direct threat issue when it's not handled correctly. It cannot change the operations of the business or be cost prohibitive. EEOC has already talked about the fact that they've seen a lot of business saying we cannot afford the accommodation because we've lost revenues during this time. That is something that's a justified reason why a business cannot provide reasonable accommodation, because they've lost revenues during COVID-19, and that is justified. And then, of course, the whole issue of COVID-19 as an undue hardship. Luckily, there's funds out there for small businesses, between the PPP loans and the PPE distributions, hopefully, and the resources for that. Small businesses are able to have less of a financial hardship when it comes to mitigating their situation. But we know in terms of revenue, that's a whole nother conversation. And so we do know, for the sake of time, we're going to pass the scenarios. We're going to talk about, just to wrap it up, our resources. We are an affiliate of the Northeast ADA Center, which is out of Cornell University. They've got a new small business toolkit, which Virgin Islands was part of their research to create that toolkit. And so please visit that. They do have a COVID-19 page. The Job Accommodation Network, COVID-19 regarding reasonable accommodation. JAN, as it's finally known, is a very, very great big resource for employers. They have a portal both for employees and they have one for employers. Check it out. I've given the link for reasonable accommodation during COVID-19 per their website. And then, of course, the EEOC COVID-19 ADA Rehab Act and other EEO laws. This is a link that I mentioned in the beginning, which should be your guidepost. Again, I want to make sure that it's in our resource section. This will give you a lot of information, and it's just really the starting point, but it's a good starting point in terms of that. I think with that, just so you know how to reach Northeast ADA Center, they have a toll-free number you can call in the Virgin Islands, 1-800-949-4232. You can email them at northeastada@cornell.edu. As an employer, you can talk to someone about your ADA issue, including reasonable accommodation. You can receive free materials and information and referrals. I myself used to work at the Northeast ADA Center, and I talked to many employers. Please do call them. Call them before you have to call your attorney. You can save money, you can get the information, and you know what? You may not have to seek legal counsel. Maybe you've gotten, but if you do, at least you've gotten some free information that can help you get going in the right direction. Okay. And of course, we are the Disability Rights Center of the Virgin Islands. Our mission is to protect the just treatment of people with disabilities, namely people with developmental disabilities. We are territory-wide. Our website is www.drcvi.org. Please give us a call if you're in St. Thomas, St. Croix, St. John, Water Island, and just know that we are here working remotely. Some of us are working in the office, but do know we will respond back to you within a day or so of your request, and we look forward to serving you more with these trainings. And the last thing I will say is that we do these trainings with EDA. We also partner with SBDC and other organizations to provide almost on a monthly basis of information related to ADA and COVID-19. So be looking out. And our next training with EDA, SBDC, Department of Labor, and the federal EEOC is on March 11th. We'll be talking about COVID-19 and ADA again, some different updated information. And so be looking for that as well. Chanel, I will hand it back over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shami. I got a little background noise at this exact moment, but we do appreciate you joining us today for this webinar. Always great to have you and partner with DRCVI. As was mentioned, where the individuals can find the recordings for this particular webinar, it'll be at www.usvieda.org/webinars. So we do encourage folks who are interested in getting some or recapping and getting some more details that may have been missed throughout this webinar to visit our website, usvieda.org/webinars. And also we have placed an evaluation link. So we would appreciate your feedback today on behalf of Ms. Carr and her presentation that is in the chat. And coming up next week's Wednesday webinar will be canceled. However, we do have quite a bit going on next week. So we will be launching our e-marketing training course on Tuesday from 5:30 to 7 p.m. And that's actually, Tuesday, February 9th. And on the 10th, Wednesday, February 10th, we'll be having our USVI Apparel Forum with the Incubator Business Program within the Virgin Islands Economic Development Authority. And that is going to be a 4-hour forum. Very exciting to have Mr. John Hope back for that entrepreneurship training. So again, thank you, Ms. Carr, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Looking forward to seeing some folks next week for some additional training courses.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Stay well.